Hey guys, welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is American History, Chapter 33, The Rise and Fall of Richard Nixon. This is Lesson 153, Nixon's First Term. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Nixon White House, Richard Milhouse Nixon, something of a cross between LBJ and Dwight Eisenhower. He's got the political skills of LBJ, maybe not as good working a room, but on the other hand, brilliant at calculating people's positions and likely responses. But a kind of a cool personality, more like Eisenhower. Born in California in 1913, attended Whittier College, Duke Law School, served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. Right after the war, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives at age 33. Served on the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. And he really kind of made his political bones there. And in one of the very charged events of the late 40s, early 50s, he would support Whittaker Chambers and his claims that Alger Hiss, a senior member of the U.S. State Department, was in fact a Soviet agent. And ultimately, Nixon would be proved right on that position. Elected in 1950 to the U.S. Senate, 37 years old. I think he was the youngest senator at the time. And then selected as the vice presidential nominee along with Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. Up until that point, his career had been one of unbroken success. He loses that heartbreak cliffhanger to Jack Kennedy in 60, goes back and runs for governor of California, and he is going to be severely beaten in 1962. Now, he is able, as we've seen, to win the 68 election over a badly divided Democratic Party. The themes of the Nixon White House: to achieve peace in Vietnam, find a way for the U.S. to withdraw, peace with honor, as Nixon would put it, and he wanted to reconcile America from all the divisive protests that we had been seeing. His cabinet was not super important. Secretary of State William Rogers, Secretary of the Treasury David Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. His aides were probably more significant: Chief of Staff H.R. Bob Haldeman and his domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman. And these two guys together are sometimes referred to as the Berlin Wall. In part because they're both German, in part because they walled off people who wanted to get access to Nixon. Nixon's third key aide was another German American, Henry Kissinger, who was responsible for foreign affairs. His job title was National Security Advisor, but he had more impact on foreign policy than our Secretary of State did. A couple of things that go on in the Nixon White House. There are always reorganizations. I think every president has tinkered with the structure. And we end up seeing the Office of the Budget become the Office of Management and Budget. There is a larger staff brought in. I think there's some rather harsh commentary on page 821 about Nixon making some of these changes. Much of this is fairly typical. And certainly once we hit 72 and 73, Watergate is going to create a very toxic environment in the White House. Okay, a couple of issues in foreign affairs. If you take a look on page 823, you see a picture there of Buzz Aldrin. The space program, very important. Two key facilities there. Kennedy Space Center, located on Cape Canaveral in Florida. That's where we're going to launch our rockets. And Houston has mission control. We had three related space programs: Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Mercury, 1 astronaut per capsule, and we'll get people into space and then people in orbit, Shepard and Glenn. The Gemini program, the twins, 2 astronauts per capsule, and there we'll go for extravehicular activity, EVA, or more simply, spacewalk. And also docking, the idea that we're going to have 2 capsules coming together in space and then be able to transfer personnel between them. And we finally get to the Apollo series, 3 astronauts per capsule. And our ultimate plan to get to the moon is that the rocket, first of all, enters Earth orbit, stabilizes there, then has a burn for lunar orbit, then stabilizes there, and then we have the lunar module will descend to the surface with 2 of the 3 astronauts. Apollo 11 puts all the pieces together in July of 1969. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins with the famous "The Eagle has landed." And the Eagle would spend 21 hours on the moon's surface. When we look at the Apollo program, it's going to cost America about $30 billion. It's going to produce jobs for more than 1/3 of a million Americans. We're going to get some new technology, stuff like Velcro and Gore-Tex. A lot of scientific data on how the solar system works. And certainly it's going to raise the national spirit. At a time of division racially and culturally, this is a moment where America backs up Kennedy's projection that will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Nixon is going to be a road warrior. He is going to take a number of trips, one to a series of NATO countries, first priority, Belgium and Italy and Germany, England and France in early '69, and then another visit to Britain. We often talk about the special relationship between the Americans and the Brits. Even though they're 2 nations separated by a common language, they have a closer set of values than most other countries. Then there's an Asian trip where Nixon will go to the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand, India and Pakistan, and culminate with a visit to President Thieu in South Vietnam, assuring those countries of American support. And then he'll take a Mediterranean swing, Italy, Spain, Yugoslavia, the American 6th Fleet, and he'll have an audience with Pope Paul VI. Now, what is Nixon going to do with the communist world? And his background is strongly conservative, very combative, and an enemy of communism. And he instead proposes a policy of détente, a relaxing of tensions. One of the things we're going to see in life is the fact that conservatives often act a number of reforms. Liberals who have been demanding those reforms find it very hard to yap when conservatives then execute their particular version of what the liberals want to see. So why should we oppose all communists per se? Maybe they've gotten way better since Marx and Lenin and Stalin. And now Nixon chooses to improve American relations, especially with China. Now, Nixon understood this. China and the Soviet Union were not getting along well. They may be both on the red team, but they did not enjoy each other. We literally had open warfare along the Amur and Ussuri rivers near the border of Siberia and Manchuria. They were shooting at each other with rockets. And Nixon comes up with the idea that making an opening toward one country will give him leverage against the other country. And the question is going to be, who's he going to cuddle up with? And who's he going to look to squeeze? And for Nixon, the key issue is, who's the bigger threat to American national security? And the answer is, the Soviets have all those rockets. Another way to look at that, who has done more to damage American interests in the world. Well, the Soviets had just invaded Czechoslovakia, a country that had been reforming and liberalizing in what was known as Prague Spring, and the Soviet answer was send in the tanks. Okay, so we start with a little cultural exchange. We send them a ping pong team. They send us a ballet troupe. And the Chinese were so nice when our ping pong team went over there. I mean, they were the best in the world at that. And so our guys would be allowed to win a few points every game, but they won all the games. And after the cultural exchange, Kissinger will travel to Beijing to arrange a presidential trip. And the cost of improving relations with China is going to be giving up that seat on the UN Security Council from the Republic of China, or Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China, or mainland China. Nixon's willing to pay that price. He travels to Beijing with Kissinger in February of '72. They will meet the Chinese Premier, Zhou Enlai, and Mao will spend part of a day with Nixon. Now, Mao didn't come to the office anymore. It's not like he went to work on a regular basis, but he still had ultimate political control in China. I think in your book on page 829, you see a picture there of the Nixons having a dinner in China. Now, right after he goes to Beijing, he is going to travel to Moscow in May, a mere 3 months later, and there sign a series of missile agreements with Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Now, Brezhnev comes in '64 when Khrushchev is pushed out, and he is going to last 18 years. We're going to go through a handful of presidents, and it's still Leonid Brezhnev as the Soviet General Secretary. And not a nice guy, but at least very easy to predict. He was like a watered-down version of Joe Stalin. You could write his speeches. I mean, he was kind of like Bill Belichick. Everybody knew what he was going to say about everything. You got very few surprises out of Brezhnev. Now, we're going to sign two limits on missiles. One is offensive, and one is defensive. The defensive limits were very similar. Each side got 2 missile sites. Each missile site got 100 missiles. And the assumption was that both sides would put one site near their capital and the other site somewhere near their missile silos to protect them from being hit with a surprise attack. So that would be the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, a limit on defensive missiles. Now, we're also going to see a limit on offensive missiles. How many missiles can you have? And it turns out you can have as many missiles as you have on the day they signed the agreement. And the U.S. has 1,700 plus missiles. The Soviets have 2,300 plus. So they have a good chunk more than we do. And the missile systems were not completely similar. The Soviets tended to have larger size warheads, what were called bigger payloads, but the Americans tended to be more accurate in the guidance systems. What was called the circular error probable about where they would come down tended to be a little closer. So the thought was, if the Americans hit the target, you don't need a huge warhead to make it go boom. The Soviets, not knowing if they could hit the target, needed to make really big bangs to knock stuff off. Collectively, these two agreements, offensive and defensive missiles, will add up to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk system, the SALT system that will continue for a while. All right, what's happening in the war in Vietnam? Henry Kissinger sees very little chance to win this war, sees that America leaving, bailing out on an ally is going to look very bad for our position in the world. So we're going to need to try to negotiate an answer with North Vietnam. We want to reduce popular opposition to the war. The anti-war movement is generating a lot of traction in the United States, and let's try to turn down the volume on that. Secondly, let's try to give a non-communist, independent South Vietnam a chance for survival. We might not be able to guarantee it, but can we end up with them having a fighting chance? He's going to do a couple of things. One is to negotiate with North Vietnam. Their representative will be Le Duc Tho, and Kissinger will fly secretly to Paris and hold negotiations there with Tho. Now, the second big part of the plan is get out of the search and destroy missions, which are causing so many casualties to American ground troops. Let's stop beating the jungle looking for Viet Cong. Let's turn the ground fighting over to South Vietnam. We'll do the supply thing. We'll do the air power thing in a major way. And then Nixon will start to withdraw American combat forces. In the summer of '69, we peak 543,000 men. But he announced that we would return 25,000 of those the following month, bringing us down to 518,000. Second withdrawal will be announced in September. We'll withdraw 35,000 more, down to 483. Third withdrawal will be announced in December of '69 to take place by April of '70. Another 50,000 men out, down to 433,000. And a very large withdrawal will be announced in April of '70 that within 13 months, America will pull out 150,000 troops. We'd be down to 283,000. Now, it is pretty clear that this is going to reduce American combat power and influence on the ground. Now, we're going to see the war spread, at least in the public eye. Now, up until this point, North Vietnam had been routinely violating international law by moving men and equipment from North Vietnam into South Vietnam by going west into Laos, south into Cambodia, and then back east into South Vietnam. And ultimately, the network of trails and bases would be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And North Vietnam had something close to 50,000 men dedicated to the ongoing operation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, they were, of course, not entitled by international law to be using Laotian and Cambodian territory without the approval of those governments, which they did not have. Now, the U.S. will begin to bomb North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia in March of 1969, known as Operation Menu. We're going to drop about 100,000 tons of bombs. This is an operation which Nixon chooses not to publicize. Now, a leader of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk, was a neutralist. He was not terribly effective at holding down the Khmer Rouge military, and one of the more pro-U.S. generals, Lon Nol, would launch a coup against Prince Sihanouk in March of 1970, and Nol would almost immediately ask for American military assistance. Nixon would send American troops into Cambodia to seek out and destroy both Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regular army units that were located on Cambodian soil. Now, there is a contrast here. What we did was legal because it was with the permission of the sitting Cambodian government. What North Vietnam had been doing consistently over time for years and years was illegal. Now, the anti-war movement in America then goes ballistic without sort of any appreciation that the other side has been doing this. Wasn't really a secret to anybody, but somehow we were obligated to adhere to rules the other side wasn't obligated to adhere to. In a number of ways, the anti-war movement didn't appear to have America's best interest at heart. Now, of all the protests that will become famous, the one that will stick in the public mind, is the one at Kent State University in Ohio. There is some student violence. The governor calls out the National Guard. The troops will be frightened by the protesters, and they will fire. And in a very brief period of time, you will have 4 protesters killed and 11 wounded on the 4th of May, 1970. All right, what's the backstory here? Kent State, about 21,000 students. Their local chapter of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, had been banned for their advocacy of violence. There was a riot on the 1st of May, windows broken, fires started, cars torched and flipped over. On the 2nd of May, the ROTC building was burned. Firemen responded to the call. The protesters attacked the firemen, cutting their hoses, attacking some of the firemen physically to prevent them from putting out the blaze. At that point, the National Guard gets called, and when they showed up, they're going to be subject to attack by thrown rocks. And the protesters cut down some small trees, douse the lighter leafy ends in gasoline, and light them on fire and use them as gigantic flaming torches. We have about 1,000 students against about 100 guardsmen. So you have a 10-to-1 superiority of students in terms of numbers. The guard announced that the students were required to disperse. They ignored that. The guard attempted to deploy gas canisters, and the students will pick them up and throw them back and continue with rocks and concrete being thrown at the guard. 58 members of the guard were injured by flying debris, and they will retreat to a hilltop, and the students will close in around them from all sides, not leaving them an avenue to retreat from their scenario. And at some point, somebody gets hit, and the guy next to him starts to shoot. 13 seconds. And we end up seeing 15 students shot. I got to tell you, throwing rocks at guys with loaded guns is seriously stupid behavior. You are nominating yourself for the Darwin Award. And you have a right to protest. You have a right to an opinion. You have a right to express it publicly and peaceably. You don't have a right to throw rocks at police officers or the Army. And, well, we have 4 individuals who are not there to procreate and add their genes to the next generation. They kind of self-selected for that. 80 schools across America will suspend classes. 75,000 demonstrators show up in Washington. The Senate will repeal the Tonkin Gulf Resolution by a substantial margin, almost as big a margin as they passed it by to begin with. Nobody really knew what that meant. Did Nixon now lose the authority to use force to defend South Vietnam? Folks were not really sure what the legal implications of a withdrawn resolution would be. South Vietnam now makes an attempt to advance into Laotian territory to try to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail much further north, much closer to its points of origin inside North Vietnam. And that incursion is going to be roundly whipped by the superior North Vietnamese military forces. Public confidence in Nixon will begin to drop. And at this point in time, we're going to see the New York Times publish a study on the Vietnam War that will be collectively known as the Pentagon Papers. A guy who wrote a large portion of that study was Daniel Ellsberg, and he had been a contract employee underneath the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and he did a series of studies to show how ineffective American policy had been. Now, as this is leaked, classified documentation leaked from the government to the press, Nixon applies to the Supreme Court for an injunction, an order for the court not to publish classified documents. For Ellsberg to release the documents was a crime, and Nixon's going to try to argue that the court should, that the paper should not take advantage of that criminal activity. Now, the court is going to reject his argument and allow the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Well, Nixon's getting really frustrated with leaks of classified government data, and he is going to create a unit to try to figure out where that's happening and how to stop it. That will be known as the Special Investigations Unit. Now, over time, somebody's going to be a little bit of a wise guy and say, well, look, if the unit is really designed to plug leaks, why don't we just call them the plumbers? So that's going to become their common name. Chuck Colson, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, John Paisley will be some of the lead plumbers. Now, these guys are idea people. They sit in offices and figure out what to happen, and they hire junior plumberettes who actually go out and do all the work. One of their plans is to break into the office of a psychiatrist that Daniel Ellsworth is seeing. And the thought is, look, if we can get some sort of written diagnosis that Ellsworth is a couple of Fruit Loops short of a full bowl, we're going to be able to say, look, who really cares what this guy wrote? He's really a very troubled individual, and you can't pay him too much attention. All right, while all that's cooking, the U.S. wants to get out of the war in Vietnam. As we've been pulling people out, we are going to see North Vietnam make an attempt to win the war on the battlefield in the spring of 1972 by launching a major offensive. 120,000 troops, Soviet armor, and they are going to capture the northern province of Quang Tri. Nixon will drop the restraints that have been instituted by LBJ back in '68, and for the first time in 4 years, we're going to be bombing north of the border. Operation Linebacker 1. We'll be bombing Hanoi. We'll be mining Haiphong Harbor. We will look to cut off the movement of supplies from China and the Soviet Union into North Vietnam, and in turn, limit their ability to launch an offensive across the border into South Vietnam. More troop withdrawals continue. American strength down to 32,000. And the anti-war movement is getting smaller and smaller because we're just not losing very many people. We're not taking combat missions. We're not taking casualties. So opposition drops. Now, in the fall of '72, after the North Vietnamese military offensive is defeated and turned back by U.S. air power, we have an initial ceasefire reached between North Vietnam and the United States. North Vietnam will give up the remaining prisoners that it's holding. America will get out in 60 days. North Vietnam will be able to keep its forces on South Vietnamese territory. There will be a coalition government that will include some members of the National Liberation Front, the political face of the Viet Cong. Now, President Thieu in South Vietnam is going to object to this. He doesn't like the idea that North Vietnam keeps folks on South Vietnamese soil. He absolutely objects to the idea he's going to have to bring communists into his government. And so the agreement is going to collapse. The U.S. election comes, Nixon is reelected by a landslide. And trying to get North Vietnam and South Vietnam on the same page, the U.S. will vastly escalate a series of bombing missions that will take place in late December '72. This will be known as the Christmas bombing. We have 100 B-52s, 500 smaller planes in Operation Linebacker 2. And there's an attempt to send a message in two directions. A, to North Vietnam, make a deal or prepare for a very expensive urban renewal program. To South Vietnam, the message is, We're pulling out. That's going to happen whether you like it or not. But what we promise you is that if North Vietnam violates the peace agreement in a major way, the U.S. Air Force will come back, reach out and touch someone in ways that they don't want to get hit. Nixon announces a halt to American offensive action in January of 73 because of progress in the peace talks. We'll have a ceasefire signed late January and a final agreement signed by Secretary of State Rogers on the 27th of January. The fighting had led to American losses of about 56,000 dead and another 1,200 or so MIA. In all likelihood, those folks died and simply weren't observed, and the bodies were never found or recovered. North Vietnam agreed to release their remaining prisoners. We agreed to be out in a 60-day window. Now, South Vietnam is going to be in trouble. As a last attempt to shore up their position, we will transfer all of the weapons and all of the bases that the U.S. had in South Vietnam will be handed over to the government. And we still have this promise of bombing if there is a major violation of the peace agreement. So I think Nixon would probably have said at that point, we accomplished the mission. It was peace with honor. We gave South Vietnam at least a chance to survive as an independent, non-communist nation. Okay, where are we on domestic affairs? This is clearly for Nixon a lower priority. Partly because his own interest is foreign policy, and partly because the Democrats had both the House and the Senate. He wasn't going to get a whole lot through Congress, and so he didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. Nixon had complained about a very activist Supreme Court under Earl Warren. Warren will retire, and just to torque off students everywhere, Nixon will nominate Warren Burger to replace Earl Warren. And the Senate will confirm him as the new Chief Justice. The Burger Court is going to rule that segregation in Mississippi schools had to end at once in 1969. You may remember the Brown case. 54, segregation was unconstitutional. 55, integration with all deliberate speed. Okay, so now we're 14 years later, and the court's getting tired of Southern districts playing games on racial integration. The court is going to rule that communities had to integrate school systems, not individual schools, but all schools within a geographic district. They had to have in each school a ratio of students by race that reflected the ratio in the school district as a whole. Now, let's make up a hypothetical example. Let's have 10 schools in a district, and let's assume that 9 of the 10 schools are 100% white, and one of the 10 schools is 100% black. Since the overall district ratio is going to be 90% white, 10% black, each school is going to have to be 90% white, 10% black. So each white school is going to have to bus 10% of its students over to the black school, and the black school is going to have to bus 90% of its students, 10% to each of the 9 white schools. And Nixon is going to be very unhappy with this particular solution. And he believes in integration, but he doesn't believe in the use of force busting. He thinks every child should be able to go to the local school district. And for a number of constitutional scholars, there's a belief that there may have to be some changes made in southern places where segregation had been by law de jure. But what about places where people simply chose to live in their own ethnic enclaves? Italians with Italians, Jews with Jews, Russians with Russians, blacks with blacks. The Supreme Court has now said that's racially unconstitutional. And busing is going to be a big issue throughout the 1970s. We're going to bring in a couple more new justices: Harry Blackmun from the U.S. Court of Appeals, Lewis Powell, who had been the president of the American Bar Association, and Assistant Attorney General William Rehnquist, who will be first an Associate Justice, and then when Warren Burger retires, he will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, this is by and large a more conservative court. It will continue to push for racial integration in schools. It will stop inventing any new rights for criminals. Nixon's going to change the American voting age, which had been 21 years old. He's going to lower it to 18. And the thought at the time was that if a soldier is old enough to get drafted and be sent to Vietnam to fight in a war for his country, he ought to be old enough to vote. And the 26th Amendment is going to extend this from federal law to a part of the American Constitution that will be ratified in 1971. All right, let's finish tonight talking a little about inflation. And that is when the costs of goods rise. So dollars buy less stuff. This is something that had seriously started under LBJ in his pursuit of what we'll call a guns and butter economy. Guns, the war in Vietnam; butter, the Great Society programs. The American government is spending all these dollars on all these resources, and there are not enough resources to do everything, so the price of things goes up. Nixon wants to get rid of inflation. There are not a lot of people that like inflation. It's kind of like hypocrisy. You just can't find a lot of people who are fans of hypocrisy. So Nixon wants a balanced budget at around $200 billion a year with a low rate of inflation. In America, we often talk about the misery index, which is going to add two numbers: inflation and unemployment. Both of those are seen as bad things. And by and large, if you add up those two numbers, inflation and unemployment, and you get to a number that's less than 10, the American people are doing their little happy dance, and the president is very likely to get reelected. If you add those two numbers up and you get over 15, you get a lot of cranky voters. That's not a good sign for a sitting president. It's a very good time for the challenger. And oftentimes we have a number between 10 and 15, which is sort of break even. The economy is not likely to be a key issue. Congress keeps passing laws. Congress loves to spend money from the future. Giving people stuff now that gets put on the government charge card and runs up the national debt tends to get congressmen reelected, which is usually their highest level of priority. We've still got war going on in Vietnam. We've still got opposition to the Soviets. We've still got a nuclear program. All of this is costing money, and Nixon's feeling the pressure. Now, for his first year or so in office, he does not do a lot. Takes sort of a laissez-faire economic approach, kind of like Herbert Hoover with the Great Depression. Didn't work for Hoover, didn't work for Nixon. Nixon didn't wait as long. He is going to put a 10% surcharge on imported goods so that Americans will buy less from overseas. We'll have the first peacetime wage price freeze in American history. Nixon will ask foreign governments to raise the value of their currency against the dollar, and they in turn will ask America to devalue the dollar. Nixon will take the dollar off the gold standard. Up until that point, the American currency was backed by a national gold supply held at Fort Knox. And that was a limit to the amount of money we could print. And now Nixon says there is no longer any direct connection between our gold supply and the amount of paper money floating around. What's the American currency backed by? Faith that Uncle Sam's money has real value. It's no longer backed by gold, it's backed by faith. Now, does it work? I drove off of Tapline Road in Saudi Arabia, went into this little roadside store. Proprietor speaks Arabic. I speak English. We can't communicate at all. I find a box of Snickers bars and a 6-pack of lukewarm Diet Pepsi. I pull out a Jackson. He gives me change in Saudi Riyals, which I brought home and gave my daughters to play with as funny money. He had faith that American currency had value, and I enjoyed my Snickers bars and Diet Pepsi. Now, I'm not sure I would try to argue that Nixon's solutions were fabulous. Ultimately, it seemed that the American people thought the gains outnumbered the losses, which, if you're a sitting president, is a good sign. The budget deficit went up. Congress is able to spend more money. $22 billion in 71, more projected for 72. Inflation drops. It's back to 3.5% by 72. Unemployment drops. It goes from 5.9% to 5.6%. You add that up and you get just over 9%. I think that's 9.1. Well, less than 10. American people are generally pretty happy with an incumbent president. Nixon kept the misery index at a level the American people were quite happy to tolerate. He had peace in Vietnam. He had the economy under control. The Soviets are participating in détente. It looks like Nixon has the world under his thumb. That turns out not to be the case. And a word which will have great significance for Americans of a certain age is the Watergate affair. And it will take this whole ball of yarn and unravel it. And at the end, drive Richard Nixon from office, the only president who has ever resigned his position. Hey guys, enough damage for one night. Go forth, do great and wonderful things. Stay safe.